Hey everyone, Mr. DVB here, and in today's video, I'm going to be ranking all of Christopher Nolan's films from worst to best, including his newest movie, Oppenheimer, which was, without a doubt, one of my most anticipated movies of the year. I think Nolan is a brilliant director. He is my personal favorite filmmaker of all time, who always continues to inspire me with each of his new films. He's one of those directors who, whenever a new movie of his comes out, I am there opening night, seeing it in IMAX, because they're more than just movies to me. They are events, they are experiences that stay with me and stick to my mind. So with that being said, prepare for what is probably going to be a fairly long video as I rank my favorite director of all time's movies. So sit back, relax,
And here we go.
So landing in last place for me is going to be Falling, which was the first film in Nolan's career, released back in 1998. This movie was made for an extremely low budget and was shot once a week over the course of a year with his friends until the movie was completed, and while it is a film that is very rough around the edges, it's still an interesting watch, especially if you're a fan of Nolan as a director, just to go back and see how he started out in filmmaking. It's still a well-made movie, and it still includes some of his, tropes that are still around nowadays, such as his non-linear storytelling, where you're cutting back between flashbacks and present events, learning more details from each every time we see that, and then creating, a grand story. So it's quite interesting, seeing those elements play out. On this movie, it is definitely his smallest scale film. This isn't, the size of Dunkirk or anything like that. It is a small scale movie, but it still tells an interesting story. I still think, there's solid performances, and overall, it is definitely one worth checking out, especially if you like Nolan as a director, just to see where his career began. Just note that, like I said, it is rough around the edges. It's not as well made as his other movies because it was so low budget. Next up in my ranking is going to be Insomnia, which is actually the only film in Nolan's filmography that he did not write himself. And I think that's why it's one of my lesser favorite films of his, is because it really doesn't feel like it's a Nolan movie. It's still well made, and I still think it's a solid film, but it doesn't have his signature style. It was still very early on in his career, so from a direction and visual standpoint, it definitely doesn't stand out as much as some of his other movies. And then, just from a story standpoint, it doesn't have that Nolan element to it. It's just a solid murder investigation movie, and that's one of my favorite subgenres. Silence of the Lambs, Seven, two of my favorite movies of all time. Obviously, this doesn't compare to those, but I do think, in the genre, I think it is, I'd say, above average. I don't think it's great. It certainly has some issues. My biggest problems with the movie probably have to do with some of the decisions in the editing room. There are some sequences in this that are really weirdly cut and just kind of annoying to follow the action sometimes. But otherwise, the writing is good, the story is solid, I think the performances are very well done. Al Pacino and Robin Williams work extremely well on screen together, and the fact that those two worked with Nolan is pretty great, especially so early on in his career. The movie also has Hilary Swank, who plays the assistant or whatever to Al Pacino's character, and I think she does a good job as well. So the movie certainly has its solid and positive elements. It's just, in the long run of Nolan's filmography, one of his lesser memorable movies. Next up on my list, I am sure this is going to be a controversial pick, but I have The Prestige. Now, I'll start off by saying that this is one of Nolan's films that I haven't seen that many times. I think I've seen it about 3 or 4 times. Other movies of his I've seen like 3 times the amount of that. And this is a movie that definitely improves with each time you watch it, so I think there's totally potential that in the future this movie could climb a spot or 2 on my list. But as of right now, where I stand with the amount of times I've seen it, it's not, that high on my list. I do still think it's great, and from here on out, I think all of these movies are extremely well made. This film, what I love about it most is its story. It has a fantastic story. You have these 2 rival magicians who are constantly trying to upstage one another, and eventually they try sabotaging each other's work, and even, get really nasty and dive into each other's personal lives. And the movie's told in a really unique way because you have 2 different storylines you're following, and then there's also false narratives, where one of the characters might write a journal that talks about their secrets, and that whole thing is just a fake diary that is made to throw the other person off. So it's really interesting, the way that the whole narrative is presented in this film, because a lot of it isn't true. It's also Nolan's most ambiguous movie, I would say, where when it ends, you don't exactly know what happens, and maybe that's something that you figure out more with rewatches, but I've always sort of viewed it as, Nolan, being the magician in this case, never reveals the trick. We never know exactly what's going on, and I think that's pretty great. Like I said, I just haven't seen this as much as his other films, so I don't personally connect to it as much. There's some elements I'm not the biggest fan of. The whole Tesla machine thing. I've seen debates online if it's real or not, but to me, it just kind of feels a bit weird in the movie when everything else feels more grounded, I guess I would say. So it's one of those things, again, I probably need to just see it again before I can, move it up on my list or anything like that. But it's still got a great story. The cast in the movie is great as always. I think Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman work super well on screen together. And like I said, just watching that whole dynamic play out, I think is a lot of fun. The rest of the cast is great though as well. Scarlett Johansson is really good in this movie. Michael Caine's here, and I just love the guy and anything he's in. And I think a really big standout in the cast in this movie is Rebecca Hall, who I think is a very underappreciated actress in general, and she gives a great performance in this movie. Alright, next up in my list, we have one of Nolan's more divisive movies, which is Tenet. Now, this is a movie that, when it released, I could not wait for it. There hadn't been any movies released in a while because of COVID, and the first one to come out was a freaking Nolan movie, so I was obviously hyped. I saw it 4 times in IMAX, just had a total blast with this movie, and it wasn't until I started rewatching it once it was released on home media where I started to pick up on some of my problems with it a bit more. I still think this movie is extremely entertaining, and it's Nolan's best action to date, and probably his most visually, wacky. Maybe not, but it still, has some really amazing sequences. But where the movie, for me, sort of feels a little weaker compared to some of his other efforts is in the character and story department. The characters here are all pretty one-note with a few exceptions. I think Kat, played by Elizabeth Debicki, is quite good in this movie. She is about the only character here who actually has somewhat of emotional depth to her. The rest of the characters, though, the protagonist, played by John David Washington, I think he's kind of a bland character. I get he's supposed to be stoic, but I just can't really get into his performance that much. I think Neil, played by Robert Pattinson, I enjoy him in the movie. Again, not a super memorable character, and as a whole, I would say the main cast is probably one of the weaker ones in a Nolan movie. The story itself can get very confusing at times because there's so much going on. The inversion aspect is obviously really cool, and the visuals and everything and the action sequences are phenomenal, but it can get kind of hard at times to follow what exactly is going on, and I know that Nolan has said, don't try to understand it, just let it happen, but sometimes it can get a little frustrating, especially when, there's a decent amount of scenes where they're sort of talking about the inversion and stuff, and the movie definitely does suffer from some of those hard-to-hear dialogue issues that people complain about with the Nolan films. It doesn't bother as much as everybody else, but there is one scene in particular where on these little boat things that I think it's genuinely impossible to hear what they're saying in that scene.
The Mystic 241, surface at the Upper House, the Shakia 114.
But, besides the characters in the story, I still think it's a super fun movie. The music is fantastic and pulse-pounding and really draws you into it. And the action sequences, the car chase, the plane sequence at the airport, and the entire final act in the desert, all phenomenal. So still a really fun movie. Just, from a character and story standpoint, it's not quite as good as some of Nolan's other films. Next up in my list is another fairly divisive Nolan movie, which is Dunkirk. This is a film that a lot of people seem to dislike because of its lack of character, and while I can understand the complaint because traditionally war movies do have, characters with a solid amount of depth to them and a personal story and whatnot, this movie doesn't do that, right? In this movie, Nolan uses the characters as a vessel to showcase this massive evacuation, and it's still a very, amazing and miraculous story where all of these people, all these civilians came together on their boats and saved thousands of soldiers from this beach during the war. So it's still an amazing story. It just, it doesn't really have characters. And I can understand the complaint. I don't think it's an invalid one. But for me personally, like I said, I view this movie as more of an event because when I saw it opening night in IMAX, I really hadn't experienced a movie like that, where I was just immediately pulled into it. The sound design is insane. It was so loud, people would be covering their ears when the planes flew over them. So it's a really, from a technical standpoint, I would argue it's maybe Nolan's best movie. Obviously he has films that are more visually, I guess, interesting with like their effects and everything with Interstellar and Inception. But to me, this movie, just seeing these World War II planes with IMAX cameras mounted on them, it's gorgeous. There are some beautiful, beautiful shots in this movie. I think it is such a amazing film from a visual perspective. I also think, just the pacing of it is great. It's a relatively short movie. It's only an hour and 45 minutes, which for Nolan is short and for a war movie is short. And it moves through that pace, or it moves through that running time pretty fast because the pacing is very consistent. It's, constantly, you have that ticking clock sound in the background that's really keeping you on the edge of your seat. You're cutting back and forth between these different events, which all take place over different courses of time. So you might be following the planes, which, spend an hour in the air, and then, the soldiers who are on the water or on the ground for a week. And so you're seeing the same events, repeat from different perspectives. And so the way it's all cut together, it's very well done. So technically speaking, I think this movie is flawless. It's just a bit lower on my list because, well, I don't personally mind the fact that the characters aren't that deep. His other movies do have that going for them, and so to me this one just isn't as memorable in the end because of that. Still think it is a fantastic film and quite an underrated one for most people. Next up for me is going to be Memento. Now this is easily Nolan's most interesting movie from a structure standpoint, and I would argue it's one of the most interesting movies of all time from a structure standpoint because it's told in such a unique and fascinating way. It has the non-linear storytelling, but it's not just as simple as flashback scene, present day scene, flashback scene, present day scene. With every single flashback scene, we're going back a little bit before the previous one and explaining how we got to that moment, because this character suffers from memory loss. So, us as the audience, we feel like we have the exact same problem, but it's told such a unique way. And it's one of those movies where with each viewing I enjoy it more and more because I pick up on more details, and they might even be very minor things that don't add a whole lot to the story, but just picking up on something new is always really cool. And so I love that about this movie. It's a very small scale film telling a relatively small scale story where this guy is just trying to find out who is responsible for assaulting his wife and leaving him with his brain injury. And so, just watching all of that unfold, it's really cool. I think it's great. I think it's so well directed, extremely well written, and the performances are great. I think Guy Pearce is fantastic in this movie. And it's just a very memorable film, and like I said, one that totally benefits from multiple rewatches. Next up on my list is going to be Batman Begins, which is without a doubt the best origin story comic book movie out there. There are other comic book movie origin films I enjoy, like the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man film, for example, but none of them come close to just telling as great of a story as this movie does. It is fantastic. If you remove the Batman aspect from this movie, it's still so well made. I mean, the story, the way it's laid out and played is great, and then just the amount of depth they give to these characters. I mean, I know a lot of people complain about DC these days being too dark and stuff, but this was a huge course correction for not only, the character of Batman at the time, but also just for comic book movies in general, to have them be this serious. And it's not like the movie's, extremely dark or anything like that, but it is more serious. It takes things in more of a realistic, grounded manner, and the way it just tells that story and writes all of these characters, it's so great, because a lot of comic book movies, the supporting cast are kind of just there, right? Like Alfred in the 90s Batman movies, he's just there, right? I still love Michael Gough in that role, but he's there because you need Alfred. Here, Alfred feels integral to the plot of these three movies. Not necessarily to the plot, but, just as a character, he is there for Bruce. He is so well written, and he has growth over the trilogy. You care about his character, right? So that when you watch Dark Knight Rises and there's that scene where he's at the funeral, it hits because, this is a character that you've just watched grow over these three movies. And so that's what I think's great about the Dark Knight trilogy as a whole, is just how great not only Bruce Wayne / Batman is, but how great all of the supporting cast is. Alfred, Gordon, Lucius Fox, etc., right? Everybody is just fantastic in this trilogy. And what I think is also quite funny about this film is that it is a comic book movie, and the action really isn't that good. Obviously, the tumbler chase it's a total blast, but the hand-to-hand combat in this movie is pretty bad, to be honest. It's always way too up close and way too you cut really quickly, so it's just hard to follow, and it's not nice to look at. And that should greatly affect a movie like this, but it doesn't, because, like I said, the story is so investing, and the characters are so detailed. So I think that's something that definitely is worth talking about. Overall, though, love the movie. I think Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul are great villains. I think that Cillian Murphy and Liam Neeson are phenomenal in both roles. They're a little underused, especially compared to the villains in the rest of the series, but I still think they give excellent performances. Also, I think out of Nolan's three films, this is the one that tonally, or whatever you want to call it, I would say I like the most. Like, just the look and feel of Gotham and everything, it's the best out of the three. But overall, excellent film. Alright, next up in my list is going to be The Dark Knight Rises. Now, there's a lot of people out there who really don't like this movie, and it tends to be near the bottom of a lot of people's Nolan rankings, and also near the, like, relatively close to the bottom for a lot of people's Batman movie rankings, which I just can't even understand. I think this movie is great. Well, technically speaking, I do think it has the most issues out of the three films with its story, and pacing and things like that. I'm a big sucker for good conclusions, and I think this movie wraps up this trilogy perfectly, right? It just puts everything with a nice bow on it. It's an emotional ending that just hits home perfectly. It wraps up everything so damn well. So yeah, for me, honestly, that does, really help the movie. But even besides that, I still think this film was great. I think that Bane, Tom Hardy, heavily underappreciated. Next to, Heath Ledger's Joker, I think he is the best comic book villain out there in live action. I think he is excellent in this movie. He brings the physicality to the role. The fight with him and Batman in the sewers is fantastic. The lack of music, it's just these two guys having this brutal, raw fight, and it's so amazing to watch. I got the chance to rewatch these movies in IMAX a couple of years ago during COVID, and that was a blast, just getting to watch all three of these in the theaters. It was amazing. So definitely, if you can ever watch these films in IMAX, do it, because they are so excellent. They are made for that format. The rest of the cast in this movie, I already talked a little bit about Alfred in this film, how I love what they do with his character here, and that ending scene is so fantastic with him. I think that the only downside of this movie for me, really, like the biggest weakness, is the character of Miranda Tate, or Talia al Ghul. I don't mind that she's in the movie. Like, I can understand it. I liked that they decided to include her character, but I just don't love the way they write her. I don't think she works out very well. I don't think the performance is great, to be honest, especially during her death scene.
It's done.
And I would have just preferred if they just kept Bane as the villain. I remember seeing the film in theaters the first time, and initially I actually liked the idea where at first they kind of make you think that Bane is Ra's al Ghul's son, and that they're just dropping the idea of Talia. I actually like that concept. And then they, undo that, and then Bane has one of the dumbest deaths of all time in a movie. I hate that death so much.
You'll just have to imagine the fire.
Anne Hathaway is Catwoman as well. Quite like her. I don't think she is perfect. I think her performance is good. I just don't quite love every aspect of the character. But I still think she's solid in the role. And overall, I still think it's a great movie that, like I said, ends the trilogy on a perfect note. Alright, next up on my list, we finally arrive at Oppenheimer. This film blew my mind, no pun intended. But yeah, this film, I've seen it twice now, and I definitely needed to watch it twice before making this ranking, so that's why it's a little bit late. But yeah, this movie, it really is a masterpiece in my opinion. From here on out, these films are all 10s for me. To be honest, Dark Knight Rises and Batman Begins are pretty damn close to that rating anyways. But yeah, this movie, I think, is without a doubt the best film to come out in 2023 so far. It is such a well-written story. I think from a writing perspective, this is the best work that Nolan's ever done. I think the script here is fantastic. The editing is phenomenal. The way that this movie cuts between all these different events and timelines is fantastic. It keeps you constantly engaged compared to if they just told it in a chronological manner. And the performances are what really make this movie. The cast is insane here. I have never seen a cast this big, honestly. It is just filled to the brim with huge actors. Some who just show up for like 1 or 2 minute scenes, but they still give great performances in those moments. But the highlights here, Cillian Murphy, fantastic in this film. It is a consistently reserved performance, right? There's not like that one scene where he yells at somebody and that's the clip that everybody's gonna use to show how great he is. Instead, his performance is, it's much more about the emotion in his face and everything. So that's why the movie has so many close-ups and stuff, and, the film is being told a lot of the time from his POV. So we're in his head, we're seeing things how he sees them, how he imagines the universe, and I just love the way they deal with all that psychological stuff. I think it was great, right? The opening scene, him looking at the raindrops, end of the movie, he's looking at the raindrops, and the meaning behind that has completely changed now because he's imagining that that's just bombs going off all over the world. And also, I could be wrong, I don't even think it's raining in that final scene. Could be wrong, but I think that's really cool if it isn't. So all that stuff's fantastic. Robert Downey Jr., incredible in this movie. I think he totally deserves a Best Supporting Actor nomination and honestly win because he was excellent in this movie. Even like little minor things that he does physically, like the way he adjusts his collar when he's aggravated. Stuff's great. Matt Damon's fantastic. Emily Blunt's fantastic. I thought Alden Ehrenreich was great in this movie. Josh Hartnett, great seeing him come back. Benny Safdie, I really liked as Teller. So just, a massive cast. I could talk about everybody in this film. They all do a good job. And it's just a really interesting watch. Like I said, fascinating story. Love the way they chose to present everything. And it has easily some of Nolan's best directed scenes of all time. I mean, obviously, everybody's going to talk about the Trinity test, right? Like, that's such an intense scene. The build-up is incredible. But there's other scenes beyond that I love. When Oppenheimer is giving his speech and then he, is kind of having like a panic attack, right? The audio sort of kind of cuts out. He starts to hear people screaming. He imagines them, burning and stuff. And then he steps in the ashes. The way the background shakes behind him. Loved that stuff. And then probably my favorite ending to a movie in a very long time. One of my favorite of all time, easily. Just when we get to see that scene again with him and Einstein and what was actually said. And then that music builds up. And I mean, Ludwig's score is phenomenal here. I've been listening to, one particular theme a lot over the last few days. And overall, I mean, just technically speaking, I think it is such a well-made movie. Cinematography and everything, it's brilliant. It is such a good film. Definitely one worth checking out. And the second watch, like I said, really helped. It made me enjoy the movie even more because I just had a better idea of what was going on. And I also, just knew people's names a lot better because there is a lot of names to keep track of in this movie, and that can definitely get a little hard at times towards the end when there's all of the politics drama going on. So definitely rewatch it if you like it, because I think it does help. Alright, moving into third place for me is going to be Inception. Now this is probably Nolan's most visually creative movie. I mean, for me, I still think Interstellar takes that cake, but for a lot of people, this film, everybody thinks of the mind-bendy world effect scene. They think of the hallway turning. There's so many visual moments that are incredible in this movie, but what Nolan does so well with his films, and with this one in particular, is that obviously, I mean, the action and the visuals and everything is fantastic here, but at the core of it, it is just, it's still telling a story about this guy who's just trying to get home to his kids. That is his goal at the end of the day. And Nolan does, in my opinion, some people think he does a bad job at emotions. I disagree. I think he does a very good job at it because, you want Cobb to get back to his kids, and, you want Coop to get back to his daughter in Interstellar, right? Nolan's always done a very good job at handling those emotions, in my opinion. And I think there's definitely some emotional scenes in this movie, right? The final scene with him and Mala, when they're talking about how they did grow old together and everything. There's totally all those kind of moments that you really need to get the audience to connect to the movie emotionally. And besides that stuff, I mean, everything else is obviously fantastic. This is a very complex movie with layers and layers to it. Dreams inside of dreams, incredible effects, really amazing sequences that just stay in your mind for years. And then obviously one of the most memorable and talked about endings of all time. So phenomenal movie overall. I think the cast is great across the board. I think the characters are all fun and just a really cool movie that obviously, I mean, has stood the test of time and I think will forever. Also, I have to mention Hans Zimmer's score real quick. It is brilliant. I think Time is arguably one of the best themes of all time. It is such an amazing score. It's one of those ones that you don't even have to just be listening to and watching the movie. You can just throw it on when you want to go to sleep or something. It's just such a beautiful score. Zimmer is excellent for that, and this isn't the last time you're going to hear me talk about Zimmer's score on this list. Alright, my runner-up coming in second place is going to be The Dark Knight. I don't know what to say about this movie that hasn't been said already. This film is an absolute masterpiece. It is the best comic book film of all time, and I don't think that will ever change for me. It's just consistently engaging. From start to finish, this is such an incredible movie that is made so well on every level. Batman Begins, I thought, was excellent for telling, the story of Bruce becoming Batman. I think this does a great job at continuing that, and then just developing the world of Gotham more by introducing us to Harvey Dent, and then, giving us Joker, who is easily the most memorable villain of all time. Heath Ledger, I mean, again, Everybody's talked about this guy for years and his performance in this movie, but it is truly remarkable. He does such a great job here, and it's a shame that we lost him so early on in his life, because he would have been so great just to see what would have happened with his career after this movie. But he totally makes this film. And I don't agree with people when they say that, oh, that's the only good element of this movie, or the only reason people like it is because of Ledger. Like, no, the movie, like I said, from across the board, everything about it is great. It has one of the best openings of all time with that bank heist scene, one of the best endings of all time. It's just filled with memorable moments, and the entire cast does a great job. Christian Bale as Batman, I love him. I think he will always be the best Bruce Wayne just because he nails that charismatic playboy billionaire persona. Alfred's great in this movie. Rachel, I like quite a bit in this film. I think that Maggie Gyllenhaal is definitely better in the role than Katie Holmes was. I think she just gives a better performance, and her role obviously adds some more emotional depth to this movie with what happens to her character and everything. And that carries over into The Dark Knight Rises, of course. Aaron Eckhart as Harvey Dent goes heavily underappreciated. I think he's great in this movie. I love the dynamic between him and Bruce and just some of their conversations they have and stuff. And yeah, he's excellent in the role. He's not Two-Face that much in this movie, but he's still great when he shows up. And yeah, I don't have too much else to say about this film that hasn't been said already. Like I said, it's incredible. And yeah, it's just such a damn good film. But finally, landing its way in first place for me is going to be Interstellar. Interstellar is that one movie that I saw in theaters when I was 12 years old that forever changed the way I looked at movies. There's just some kind of switch it flicked in my brain that just made me kind of, sit there like Danny DeVito and just go,
Oh my God. I get it.
And it was one particular scene, which is that messages scene, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But that scene is where I couldn't believe what I was watching and what was happening in front of me. But this movie, it has been my favorite movie of all time for quite a while now. For the last, I'd say probably 6 or so years, it has been up there for me. It just, not only do I love space stuff, so that whole exploration element and the incredible effects this movie has obviously work wonders for me, but what works so well about this movie, what is the best part of it for me, is the story of Coop trying to get home to his daughter. It's that emotional connection that this movie forges. I don't know if it's something that I personally relate to or not. Both of my parents, were in the military and had gone overseas and stuff before, so I've dealt with parents being gone for long periods of time. And I don't know if that's, why I like the story so much, or if it's because I relate to it or not. I'm not sure. I just know that it works great in this movie, right? I am so emotionally connected to that storyline and him trying to get home to his kids. And again, the music is a huge part of that. Hans Zimmer, I think the Interstellar soundtrack is the best soundtrack of all time. So many themes in this movie that are just beautiful, and just that combination of the piano and the organ, it is like music to your, it is music to your ears. It is phenomenal though. It's so great. It just makes every scene work, whether it's the emotional moments or it's the intense moments, like the docking scene. It's just consistently incredible. And then obviously on top of that, the visuals in this movie are remarkable. The whole wormhole sequence is probably one of the coolest visual sequences of all time in a movie. Just the way that all looks, it's insane. And then the black hole at the end when he gets pulled into the event horizon and everything. I think the biggest complaint for this movie is usually the last 20 minutes or so. And I can agree, it definitely, I think, goes a bit too much into being a bit weird and confusing and stuff. I have, done my research, and I definitely have an understanding, and I know what happens now. But it is definitely one of those endings that's just very strange for sure. But it has totally grown on me over the years. And I just think it's a fascinating movie. Recently, I got the chance to see it in laser IMAX. Not 70mm, but, still, seeing it in laser IMAX is the next best thing for me, given that the first time I watched it was in a crappy small theater with horrible seats. So that was an incredible experience, and one that I won't forget. So there you have it, everybody. That is my ranking for all of Christopher Nolan's movies. Let me know what your ranking is down below. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. The next one I'll be making, I'm not quite sure yet. I'm still on my, YouTube break thing or whatever. Haven't really been working on any short films as of late, but I need to get around to that. So stick around for news updates in the future. But until then, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.